All right, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Good vibes. You're well fed. And I have the exciting opportunity to wrap up this afternoon with everyone. And I know you all have that patience, that virtue of kindness, where you all will treat me well as we begin to close the proceedings for today. Everything Dr. Barrett said about me is untrue and more, but that is not a reflection of her character. She was really just trying to explicate and justify why I would be a good substitute teacher for this afternoon. But really and truly, I see myself fundamentally as a comrade in the work that we have to end gender-based violence in Trinidad and Tobago, the Caribbean and the Americas. That is my political space and society where I have a particular kind of investment. But globally, this is a struggle around the world. So the work that I present to you, which would provide some of the political context of our reality, is ready to speak in the context of a struggle that is happening here in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. And the work that you are doing on gender, violence, and conflict is very much part of a long movement in Caribbean and the Americas to liberate our people and to recognize equality and human dignity. It's very clear. And I'll be very interested in seeing how that work kind of moves across spaces and so on. So, I'm a graduate student in cultural studies here at the University of the West Indies. I develop research around the state in the Caribbean and small island developing states through institutional ethnography. And what I look at is state-led programs around construction, sanitation, and how that intersects with the kind of socio-spatial dynamics and understanding gender. As Dr. Barrett would have established, I have a background in working in the state sector as well, but fundamentally through social movements. It's not either or. That is, the state is a site in which we advance the work and the politics of social movements. And part of that vision is really rooted in a depatriarchalization of Caribbean society and space. There's no decolonization that is possible without depatriarchalization. We don't want halfway revolutionaries, so we need a feminist politics to advance in the public sphere. But to move beyond that, I think labels are underneath all of the values of care, love, and equality. That we need to really challenge those symbolic and structural factors that really ruin our lives. And if you want to connect with the Friendly Neighborhood Rasta, you could do it on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, all these other things. Yeah. I was supposed to have a photo here, I don't know where it's gone. But what is gender-based violence? That is an infantilizing question to an esteemed audience like this, so I'll just go straight into business. So I want to just hold space for some of the creative imagination that we have in the Caribbean. And I would like to reference Shivani Ramlochan, a very important poet, a newer poet in our landscape, who is definitely a face and a name to remember. She says, "At Juve, it doesn't matter if you play yourself or somebody else. Play a dead 8-year-old granny who had tongue like scorpion pepper, 2 foot like twin fishtail in Coral River, a smile like butter knife cutting through hot sada. Play your living mother, who made of more parts glitter than flour, who teach you softness, have more than enough space to leave a cutlass waiting, glistening between fat folds, ready to chop you from bed of ample waist. Play all the dead and all the living in you, in your short pants, in your badger drawers, in your ragged fishnets and curry gold batty riders, in your half-top, in your no-top, breast swinging under electric tape nipples, panty forgotten in a culvert overflowing with holy water and hell liquor, your own perspiration sliding between bodies at play, like the wetness from your body is purgatory unction." So, anything resonates with us there with that poem. That's an excerpt of what Shivani is working with. She's using, of course, the nation language. She's using the carnival as not just an aesthetic, but a site for play. And she's showing, right, how women, with the use of their bodies, bodily autonomy, is so central to Caribbean livelihoods and the way that we move through space. Of course, there are many layers, but subsequently we will kind of create room for dialogue. I would like to take some of the work, a poem called Barrel from Darren Sandy, another spoken word poet in Trinidad and Tobago. Before Skybox, we were barrel people. A barrel was a big thing, a first coming, set upon a sacrifice of the lower middle class. When mommy leaves, know a barrel coming. Barrel people know clearing takes a day. Customs go in and comb through your things as if to weigh the work of your migrant mother while you pray for low fees and patience. The barrel used to hold life and hope. So this thing about placing bodies in them is contrary to all things West Indian. Dwayne, you also search for our missing child, as if she had an unknown visa and took flight away from your foreign molest and murder. So this is Darren Sandy taking a very material and symbolic reality of the Caribbean space of barrels, which is part of transnational parenting, to put it in a sophisticated way. But we call people for a long time barrel babies and barrel children, right? Or calypsos, mommy, love, don't come in a barrel. Right? So this is part of the reality of economic hardships that happen in the Caribbean, or people seeking further economic opportunities moving to global north countries. I just spent a month in Jamaica. I always kind of laugh when they say like states, when they say foreign, I mean like New York, Miami, like when they have a set of people with green and black jackets selling jerk chicken. That's like foreign. States is like when you're in Oregon, like when you're overseas, that means you're like in England or somewhere else. We like have all these different spatial markers for what away means. But in the transnational like hype, which is a reality, and the emotional challenges that created, but also the movement of women, right, into global north territories and repatriating funds and resources. What Darren is doing is playing on that image and looking at gender-based violence that is happening in our society, with women literally appearing in barrels. So this is not something that is an extreme context and situation in our lives, but rather these gender inequalities and its most exaggerated form as gender-based violence is very much part of our Caribbean reality. So what gender equality is really a move for Caribbean dignity. And I want to take up the work of Rosina Wilshire-Broadbaugh, who I think really establishes what we need to understand politically about this, the crux of our work. We have learned that the alleviation of one facet of inequality does not necessarily solve the issue of inequality in other spheres. While it is necessary to put women's equality squarely on the agenda, it is clear that women in the Caribbean will only make marginal gains if the gender issue is not dealt in isolation, right? The issues of class, race, and gender cannot be isolated in any strategy for achieving an equitable and human order in Caribbean societies. This is 1988. Very much today, we accept this as the framework of intersectionality. But people like Rosina Wilshire was very central to liberation movements, not just in the Caribbean, but even in places like South Africa. And imagining what would that polity look like. And for her, gender was always part of class and so on, and I will establish the historical foundation to which we understand gender-based violence. Next, I would like to know why gender-based violence is so important to the development process. I'm not aware of the backgrounds, and we'll have a much more democratic space to hear people's backgrounds, their views, and what their personal research agendas and projects are. But for me, the development justice becomes fundamental to all the work that we do. I do not share the view that we are away from these political processes. States are very small. It's very difficult to imagine a life without the main driver of the economy. The private sector is very small in some societies. You have some Caribbean countries that are energy dependent up to 90%. So the idea that you could even imagine an economy outside of the principal player, which is the government, I think is spinning top in mud. But spinning top in mud is useless, futile. You ever heard that expression? There's no problem. Today is the first day for everything. So we spent up in mud, but we also spent up in millions, right? We keep spending money for ideas that really not generating the quality of changes that we need in our life. So development justice is important, and I implore everyone here to think about their work as contributing to a process where it improves a woman getting water at 5 o'clock in the morning. It improves the way that we have energy, right? Because in cool environments, it might be as hot. We could manage aggression. We could have certain economic services that are available at extended hours in the night. People would be able to access healthcare. To understand that crime is not something very abstract, or is not enough to say, this is a structural problem with colonial antecedents. But that is a lived reality today for people, and they're not debating colonialism when they have a knife or a gun before them. So why we may have that analysis and critique? As Amilcar Cabral, my namesake, said, we're not fighting for ideas. We're fighting to improve the material lives of women and children everywhere, right, around the world. So what is development? I look at Michael Manley. And Michael Manley said development means the capacity of a society to define worthwhile objectives for itself and then to demonstrate a capacity to realize these objectives. And that is important because I'm going to look at some of the policy instruments and the state infrastructure that exists to promote gender equality and to end gender-based violence. But the question is, do we have the capacity? Can we demonstrate that capacity to realize our objectives? Part of that is looking at the money we put aside for it. Part of it, so that's the fiscal space. Another part is the policy space. But then there's a fundamental issue of understanding and mobilization. The public needs to have an understanding that this is a development challenge, or else it will persist. But of course, implementation has to do with social organization and economic development. That means that development involves a total process, both political and economic, and the capacity that enables a nation to accomplish those goals that it defines for itself. So the work that we do, I think, in the Caribbean is fundamentally about self-determination. It is very political. And while I know in your ethics and your methodology, we may manage the ethics of care and the way we work with communities. And sometimes we may take more claims around how transformative a project is or what the state does and does not do. What we are really tasked with is understanding that development, there's a long durée, there's a long process of development that is going to happen for many years. And in the work that we do, does it enhance the capacity and agency of people? How does it connect to resources that exist in the society? Do we allow people to have solidarities that did not exist before, for them to have the power to solve problems in their lives? That is some of the transformative work and little practices of care. So let's look at intimate partner violence in the Caribbean. So prior to the Spotlight Initiative, as you can imagine, where the research spending is quite negligible in Caribbean development, that we had baseline studies produced by UN Women Multi-Country Office, which is headquartered in Barbados, which helped build the case for the Caribbean as being an important region and certain countries as sites where the Spotlight Initiative, which is a global initiative funded by the European Union to promote the gender equality, but to really effectively combat gender-based violence and family violence in the context of like Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica and so on. So globally, 35% of women have experienced a form of physical and or sexual violence by an intimate partner. 30% of ever partner women experience physical and or sexual violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. But in the Caribbean, it's almost 46%. So we are well above that global average. And of course, the numbers kind of speak for itself here. As 1 out of 2, right, ever partner woman experiencing a form of IPV in our region. And we are 55% in Ghana, 48% in Suriname, and 44% in Trinidad and Tobago. So as we can see, this is a development challenge that we are facing in our society. I want to take some, I think, more tragic data points. And this is pre-COVID, right? This is pre-COVID. COVID things didn't get nicer and better when everyone was home, right? So let's look at the Women's Health Survey of Trinidad and Tobago. And when we do our public campaigns, you really have to bring this, because I think sometimes in the work of social justice, it's like a moral crusade. You really have to just go out into communities. 7% of ever pregnant women experience physical IPV during a pregnancy. of which 2 in 5 experience worse violence during that time than otherwise. I think that is abhorrent to know that during the course of pregnancy, people are experiencing violence. And this is our reality. About 1 in 10 women experience lifetime sexual partner violence. 1 in 10 women experience economic partner violence in their lifetime. So this backdrop puts together some of the context upon which the issues that UoL studies are inextricably linked. There is some form of gendered violence on any development issue that we could take up, and I'll discuss some subsequently. For the historical roots of gender-based violence, gender hierarchies and gendered violence are the foundation of the colonial project. Dehumanization of indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, indentured Indians, and migrant groups entrenched gender inequalities, which saw the intersections of race, class, color, and gender hierarchies in society. So if you look at, for example, like Martinique and Guadeloupe with the Jean du Couleur, they created rules upon which marriage is possible, right? Why mulattoes can't wear white. You know, I love colonial laws. It's like so specific. You know, it really is like a real nerd in charge, you know, like it have like guns, cannons, boats, and then like a really smart person doing really bad things. I was like, why every colony have a botanical gardens? They don't name the flower and all, you know? I don't like that flower name. Let's rename it, you know? But, you know, they say, you know, mulattoes, I don't want you wearing white in public. Because it might be too light skin, you know? Like, when you think about it, you just can't have Steph Curry walking around and Obama, you know, just walking around the streets passing for white some days. So they just have all these rules about, like, who has sexual agency, who can get married, who cannot get married. Well, if a white man goes with like a black woman, right, that child could, you know, move along and stuff, and they may be educated. But if a white woman goes with a black man, well, that's rape, of course, right? You know, so they really codified how sexuality will be organized in society on these racist lines, not just racial, and it's class, and it's about access. And these things affect us today, right? About being brown and browning, right? Or as we say, put a little milk in your coffee, right? That is when you get like lighter skinned people into a line. And it's crazy, to be honest with you. But that is how like ideas of love are so much connected to issues of race and class and so on. Property ownership, of course, access to education, and not just the time when boys and girls could get in. Even after the liberated sectors for women to access education, the racial hierarchies in schools had to be transformed as well. And that's why the Post-Independence Project is very important. And gender hierarchies in all forms and so on. Cool. So the colonial era set in motion ways of relating as well as institutions in which violence is normalized. Claro? Is that clear? Everyone? Good. So let's look at some quick state responses. Most Caribbean countries within the CARICOM, which is the Caribbean community, has established a national gender machinery. Then, somebody need to take a picture for my mother to post this up. Yeah, sorry. So just, Alex, you will link the boy now. Yeah. Give thanks. Yes, I forgot that. Yeah. Give thanks. I look smart, you know. Like. State responses. Anybody gonna lend me the glasses? I always wanted to be a poet who has glasses and like take it down. Like my mother's guava in July. So we established national gender machineries. We have national policies on gender and development, or national gender equality policies, with the exception of some territories like Grenada, St. Lucia, Montserrat. Trinidad and Tobago is an asterisk because it's at the green paper stage. It has been approved to be operationalized in government, but it's not approved as the policy at the national level. The National Strategic Action Plans on Gender-Based Violence and Sexual Violence, Gender Mainstreaming in the Public Sector, Legislation and Policies. Institutional arrangements, Dr. Barrett is the chair of the Women, Peace and Security Advisory Committee in Trinidad and Tobago. We have like countries like Belize with the Women's Equality Commission. Several territories have interministerial committees on gender-based violence. And then increasingly, we have the GESI, the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Framework, that we are taking in development space and also in the state. But social movements really have some, I think, powerful moves that is happening in our society. Part of it is the International Days of Observation that we have, right? Of course, IWD, International Human Rights Day, challenging transphobia and homophobia and so on. Regional and transnational networks, which really scales up feminist advocacy and women's rights advocacy in our territories. LGBT space making and conferences, which are not even a small thing, just even having the Caribbean, like in Bocas Lit Fest, we have Backchat. We have the Caribbean Women's Sexual Diversity Conference, run out at ECAD in St. Lucia and like the Eastern Caribbean. And they convene queer people, lesbian, gay, bi, transgender people in public spaces and really enhance the political visibility and that work. We have legislation increasingly beginning to move around technology-facilitated gender-based violence, which is a very serious challenge with young people. And I call up on cameras, like all the cameras reach, sir. I'm shy. So yeah, sorry, it's all good, I'm shy, everyone, I'm shy. Can't you tell? Can't you tell? Yes, technology-facilitated gender-based violence. I see an interesting dialogue that is happening now where the question is, well, what about the men? What are you doing, men? And da-da-da-da-da. And then you have a mention the Equality Bureau. In Guyana, they have like the 1,000-man initiative, right? Like, or 10,000 men initiative. We need 10,000 good men to save Guyana, right? And play cricket and eat chicken curry, not curry chicken. So, but there's a move now where we think about challenging the standards of machismo in society that women and men are invested in. So it's not just patriarchy as the domain of men and their physical domination of spaces, but there are standards of machismo and patriarchal manhood that give legitimacy to certain social practices by women and men, which need to be challenged. Of course, increasing women's political participation is important. Guyana, I believe, is the only territory constitutionally which has a third for the quota in political representation. Trinidad and Tobago has women above 1/3 in the lower and upper house. However, that is not through a quota system, right? So Caribbean countries increasingly, every country does not have Mia Mottley in power, but increasingly Caribbean countries have women in political representation, but there are real structural barriers and social attitudes by women and men that really need to be transformed to increase that level of representation, of which organizations such as the Caribbean Institute for Women and Leadership, there is on debt for being, is to advance and to enhance. So there's a move happening now with social movements around decentralized services and responses, how we do work through local government and community, and of course the principal frameworks that we see in gender justice and intersectionality. I think where there's a lot of power happening with social movements and non-state actors are expanding those definitions of gender in our society. A lot of Caribbean governments mobilize the Rome Statute, I believe, that is the framework for it. But that is very reductive in what we can have for the way that we understand men and women in society and what is sex and what is gender. And there's a move to really say that we cannot keep discriminating against people, but the basis upon which we do that is the way we understand gender in society. And we're seeing that. Citizenship is a big issue. Some of you all might be aware, as we're on this theme of crime, violence, and gender, is that there is Venezuelan displacement in the Caribbean happening since like 2010s in particular, and which was accelerated after the death of Hugo Chavez as well, and the economic blockades and decline of Venezuela. And that, of course, puts new factors in the society about the ethnicity of the group, the human trafficking issues that happens, how do migrant rights are guaranteed or not, migrant rights and the challenges it may have had within the Caribbean single market economy framework. So those are migrants within the region in an organized space, and now you're having groups who are outside of that region. And of course the labor market where they would go, right? And people have the perception they're taking away jobs. But that is very much not even different from the dialogue that was happening in Barbados in the 2000s about Guyanese labor, right? Working in Guyana and so on. Now, for example, many countries we have Jamaican security services or Jamaican workers in the security services, private security services throughout the region. So groups, as you all know, in migration, the Caribbean is a history of migration, and the world is a history of migration, how people move and so on. And what we see is that the nation state, in a way, it really contains the way people think about the rights that are deserving to these so-called other groups and so on. But real issues, so that's why I said human trafficking is a real issue that we have here. And the only plus I think that really came out of this, we started to develop more robust infrastructure to try to respond to this with legislation, policies, and state responses. And this is where I begin to close, where we could have more questions and dialogue, which is that all our work, we must understand violence with a gender perspective. So one of the areas in my work would be on latrine eradication. So pit latrines, where people would have to, the same purposes they have for a toilet, they just do it with a hole in the ground. And in rural communities, it's not that challenging, believe it or not. There are some sanitation issues. But in urban areas, where there's a greater battle for space, there are a lot of indignities that happen when people have latrines. And while the state sees that as like an indignity or the way that we leave people out of modernity, because I take on that gender perspective with understanding it, I understand how sexual violence and the risk to sexual violence that happens to women and girls, but children in general, happens around latrines. And it's the duty now of the researcher and the activists to make that visible, to say that this is part of our political imperative in our society as well. When we do work on gangs, recently in April 2023, in the Caribbean, we had the public health approach to violence. So we adopted the public health approach to respond to crime and violence. That was at the CARICOM Heads of Government meeting. But if you look at that declaration, while the data which informed it from CARICOM impacts and the crime analysis, seeing why young men use small arms and the proliferation of small arms, young men as the greater perpetrator of violent crimes, but also the greatest victims of it, and then why gender-based violence is an issue, it does not make the language in the final document an outcome. And what happens when we render gender as something invisible? We just don't have that political kind of engine to drive the very important work. And that is a very important high-level commitment. So while I commend our prime ministers for seeing crime and violence beyond the kind of securitization and brute force as a way to respond to it, and understanding the public health approach, it says, see it epidemiologically, that we could begin to understand the mainstreaming of gender in that. So crime and violence at the regional level and the national level needs to have a larger gender commitment. But the reason I started with poetry is that I don't want us to treat the state as just buildings and statistics and numbers that go on reports, but there's the psychic space that we are battling for. And that is why the humanities is so important to this fight. Family violence and trauma that we could take in this very micro way through poetry and literature and the songs, where we could get the meanings of gender-based violence. And gender-based violence is the outcome of what people thought a man and a woman should be for themselves and in relation to others. It's a function of power. And that is why you have important work to unpack some of the psychic space Caribbean people are working through, right, around violence and so on. So that is a completion of what I had to say, and I would give room for questions and interest and so on, if that is fine. Nobody give me a half clap, a whole clap. That's good. Now I know that's over, and yeah. I'm shy, I told you all. So it's all good. So, but I have questions, I could respond, and in my background, we could always take them on. Yeah.
So questions